Coming up on the Q30 Newscast Special Election Edition. Hear from a political science professor on what last night's election results will mean for America.
We also spoke with multiple politicians at both the local and federal levels, as well as Hamden residents and Quinnipiac students on many issues this election.
And hear updates on news in the financial sector and all around the world following this election.
All that and more coming up on the Q30 Newscast Election Special. Welcome to the Q30 Newscast Election Special. Election Day has come, and we've got everything you need to know right here. I'm Nick Boyd.
And I'm Ben Rukavicius. From national election to the local elections around Hamden, we've got a lot to cover in 45 minutes.
Also joining us tonight is Q30 News Director Julia Barcello and a Quinnipiac University political science professor. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you, Ben and Nick. I'm Julia Barcello, and joined alongside me is Professor Sean Duffy. And tonight, we're going to be hitting the key focuses of this presidential election. But for now, Ben and Nick have the latest.
Former President Donald Trump was elected the 47th President of the United States early this morning, defeating Vice President Kamala Harris by 53 electoral votes. He becomes the second president to be elected to office two separate times alongside Grover Cleveland. Trump's win in Wisconsin was pivotal to getting to 270 electoral votes.
Trump will also be the first Republican presidential candidate to win the popular vote since George W. Bush in 2004. Trump's felony convictions were not concerns to the majority of voters, who listed leadership change and the economy as their top issues in exit polls conducted by CBS News. The Republicans also claimed the Senate last night, flipping seats in Montana, Ohio, and West Virginia. The House of Representatives is yet to be called for either party.
Let's head over to Julia and Sean. What do you guys have for us?
First of all, welcome, Sean. So let's get right into this. So last night, Trump won. As you could see on your screen right now back at home, Trump won the overall map, and he also won those swing states, including Wisconsin and North Carolina and Pennsylvania. So and including Maricopa County, as you could see right now on your screen. Sorry about that, everyone watching. President Trump now won with 295 electoral votes. So what do you think was kind of that main pushing point for those people who maybe weren't sure who they wanted to vote for? What do you think ultimately convinced them to vote for President-elect Trump?
It's always interesting how much clearer things are in hindsight, because there were so many factors going into this election that we didn't quite know where to focus. But I think what it comes down to is the economy, and not necessarily the global numbers of the economy, but how people have been experiencing the economy, not just in the last year or two, but in the last 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah, now switching more over to the topic of election security, when President-elect Trump ran in 2016, this was again a huge topic of discussion. And even today, we were seeing some ballot boxes getting caught on fire. So a lot of ballot locations had to put preventative measures for that. And a lot of people were worried about their absentees being counted and things like that. So do you think that election security was and is a concern that voters and politicians should have about this election?
From what I've heard, and this is accepting those a couple of inflaming ballot boxes a few weeks ago, it turned out to be much less of a concern than we were worried about. But I do think that we have a vulnerable electoral system, and that it has been targeted in the last couple of years in terms of trying to undermine its integrity. I think in retrospect, it's probably a good thing that we had such a decisive result last night, because while there are still some contested seats for Congress and things like that, still voting going on, I think by and large, this result gives people confidence in the electoral system, which I think is where the real danger was.
Yeah, so sticking with voters, what voters were voting on, as we spoke briefly about before, economy, that was a big topic for voters this year. So, but besides that, what do you think was the most important policy that voters were voting on for this election?
I think it has to go back to the economy. So I'm not sure there was any one policy. And in fact, it's interesting because President-elect Trump never really articulated any policy goals, and for that matter, neither did Vice President Harris. So it really wasn't a policy-driven election. It was really much more about how people were feeling about things, and both both candidates were really trying to mobilize their voters around different kinds of concerns. For Harris, it was around gender rights and reproductive freedom, and for Trump, it was around immigration and the economy. And I think that probably resonated more with the electorate.
So more into now the states versus the federal government. Republicans often want more rights in the states, and that was a big concern that I know many Republicans voiced throughout this campaign season. Do you think that kind of wanting for more rights in the state versus the federal government, do you think that played a role this time around?
You know, I think that can sometimes seem like an oversimplification. In recent years, if we look at the policies particularly that President Trump in his first administration pursued, it didn't necessarily delegate more authority to states and less to the federal government, but what it did do was kind of take some of the brakes off of the federal government. So there's a real push for deregulation, I think, and there will be a big push for deregulation in the next Trump administration, which means that if we want environmental protection, if we want educational reform, if we want these kinds of things, we won't be able to look to the federal government for them. We're going to have to do it state by state.
So something that both Harris and Trump really ran heavily on during this campaign season was just overall protecting democracy. And this means different things to voters. So how do you think that played a role in this election for people who wanted to vote for Trump, people who wanted to vote for Harris? What do you think they found that difference was?
I suspect that those who voted for Trump might have disregarded a lot of this as a lot of sort of flack thrown up to distract the voters. I think those who were voting for Harris are still very much concerned about the direction the incoming Trump administration looks like it might be taking in terms of undermining some of the things that we take for granted in a liberal democracy, like constraints of government, checks and balances on presidential power, and those kinds of things. So I think the jury is still out. I don't think that those concerns about democracy have gone away for a large section of the electorate.
Yeah, you talk about those concerns on the democracy. What do you kind of want to tell voters who are maybe liberal voters who are now very concerned about President-elect Trump being in office? Maybe they're concerned about those rights. What kind of are your thoughts on that?
I think what we have to do is we have to ensure people that a really vibrant democracy, which I think we still have in the United States, a vibrant democracy is one where individual citizens take responsibility for protecting the democracy. And that doesn't mean just every 4 years when we go to the ballot boxes. It means every day on the streets and in the way we conduct ourselves and promote our interests in the public sphere.
Yeah, that's going to wrap us up for right now, so we'll head it back to Ben and Nick.
Thank you guys for the insight. Now we've got to take our first break of the night.
But when we return, we'll hear the latest on local election results here in Connecticut and hear from some local voters. Stick with us. We'll be right back.
My name's Stacy, I'm 57, and I was adopted in 2020. One teen can come in and make you look at life in a whole different way.
You know, he's my father, so I look up to him a lot. If I can be 10% of the man he is, I'll be a happy person for sure.
Learn about adopting a teen from foster care. You can't imagine the reward. Visit adoptuskids.org.
When I was in foster care, I never knew when I would have to move. So I always had my suitcase ready to go. Then one day, I was adopted. My new parents opened their hearts and home to me. My parents cook my favorite breakfast for me every morning. My parents take me on trips I never thought I would go on. They gave me a home and an even better reason to use that suitcase. My parents aren't perfect, but they're perfect for me.
Welcome back to the Q30 Newscast. In addition to the national election, there were many races on the state level that took place yesterday.
Despite their national showing, Democrats did relatively well locally. Incumbent State Senator Gary Winfield won his race against Republican challenger Nyrel Moore by 54 points in Senate District 10. The Hamden-New Haven area's other state senator, Martin Looney, also defeated Republican Steve Orozco to win a 15th term in District 11.
U.S. Representative Rosa DeLauro, who represents Connecticut's 3rd District, and Senator Chris Murphy also both won re-elections in their races.
Local elections are just as important as the races for president and Congress.
Q30's Evangeline Crosley spoke with the local candidates about the issues facing Hamden.
Q30 had the opportunity to sit down with 3 local politicians, 2 who are running for Senate and 1 for the House, about their opinions on pressing topics this election. First, we spoke with Hamden Mayor Lauren Garrett about the issues she believes her constituents care most about.
Really, the problem is affordability. Inflation has come down, but because it was so high for a period of time, it's really hard to afford groceries. A lot of bills with prices rising.
The 3 candidates we spoke to shared their issues with the current economy and how they'd plan to fix it.
We need to provide assistance to employers so that they feel confident to hire more people, to expand apprenticeship programs and workforce development training programs.
One of the things that I'll be working on certainly is the child tax credit, which helps working families.
So New Haven has a economic vitality problem. Like I said, we overspend and we don't have a lot of opportunity here.
Mayor Garrett also highlighted education as being on the ballot this election.
This is an important election for people in Hamden who want to make sure that the EPA and the Department of Education are protected.
Politicians shared their plans and policies if elected or re-elected into office.
We need to put more resources not only into K-12 education, but also to higher education, and also to assist private colleges and universities like Quinnipiac, who have a lot of Connecticut residents in their student body.
We need to be doing a much better job of putting money towards our education system. Our teachers are dramatically underpaid compared to many first world countries, and I think that it shows.
Right now, we spend roughly $21,000 per year per child in the city of New Haven. And for our kids to not be proficient in math and English, when we're spending that much money, I mean, something's got to change.
Now, one common sentiment across all of these candidates was their hope for bipartisanship and that they could bridge the gap across both parties. Reporting from the Miller Library for Q30 News, I'm Evangeline Crossley.
Now that we've heard from some local politicians, it's time to hear from the voters' perspectives.
Q30's Beckett Calkins has the story on how Hamden voters are feeling about the election.
Thanks, guys. We talked to voters outside Miller Library. We got their opinions on the different issues they're voting on in this year's presidential election.
For me, abortion. I'm pro that women can need to decide what they do with their bodies.
Border policy for sure, and financial responsibility and foreign affairs.
It's a lot to do with the medical expenses because I'm old, retired, and the cap on the medical. If the way I voted turns out good, it'd cap it at $2,000, which is a very big help for me being retired on a fixed income.
I'm more on the religious side, so I do vote more conservatively.
Probably tax cuts. I think tax cuts is the most important thing because families have been struggling to buy their groceries, and I think it's important that they have some money left over from their paycheck to be able to buy things that they need.
The local impact of the election is something Hamden residents are also voting on.
Hopefully it does impact. I see a lot of things. I live in Hamden, and there's a lot going on around here, crime-wise, a lot happening. Things have changed since I've grown up, and you just want to see things to be better. That's it. So hopefully on a national level, we see that, on a local level as well.
Like more jobs, just more money especially to Hamden, which I've been living here for a minute and so far has been very good.
Despite different political opinions, each voter stressed the importance of filling out a ballot.
Decided to vote because, it's our right as an American citizen. We all have the right to vote for whoever we choose benefits us the most. And I think right now, personally, I don't think we have the greatest, options, but, we do have that right to vote, and I think you vote for whoever benefits you the most.
Well, I'm concerned about the state of my country, and I want to make sure that my voice is heard.
I think it's my right to do so, and I wanted to exercise it. Even though it took 3 hours, I'm happy we did it. We're going to go get some pizza.
Overall, voters are excited for their voices to be heard, not only on a national level, but locally as well. Reporting from the Miller Library, Becky Calkins, Q30 News.
Staying on the local side, Senator Richard Blumenthal spoke to Q30 about the importance of this election.
And Senator Chris Murphy discussed the pressing issues in this election.
The larger the turnout, the better for democracy, because the results will really reflect the will of the American people, which I think is to move forward, not backward, to protect women's reproductive freedoms and rights, our education system, affordable health care. There's so much on the line.
So what matters here is, are we doing things to drive down the cost of health care? Well, in the last couple of years, we've reduced prescription drug costs. We've capped Medicare drug costs for seniors. And then they want to know that tax cuts, when we give them, are going to middle class and working class families here in Hamden instead of to billionaires and millionaires.
Connecticut, by and large, remained blue this cycle at both the state and national levels.
To hear more about the impact of the local Connecticut elections, we'll send it over to Julia.
Yeah, a lot of those politicians, local state politicians, also spoke about the education system. In 2016, when former President Trump first ran, we saw this being a large topic of conversation, especially in states like Florida. We saw the whole conversation of critical race theory kind of come back to the table. Now that President Trump has been reelected, do you think we're going to see that discussion kind of come back on?
My interpretation of that discussion is that it's largely been used by the Republican Party for the most part to mobilize their base, and particularly at the state level. I don't really see it coming at the national level now. I think this is another area where the benefit of having a decisive victory for the Trump campaign and what looks like it could be a unified government for the first time in years under the Republican control, they might not need to inflame passions with that whole question of critical race theory. Education is by and large a state level thing. The federal government has very little to do with it anyway. And as you mentioned, or as the newscast mentioned, Connecticut remains by and large Democratic controlled, and I think we won't see very much difference in terms of education policy here in the state.
Something else that a lot of these local politicians were talking about, even President-elect Trump has been running his campaign over, is infrastructure. Mm-hmm. I know Mayor Lauren Garrett of Hamden a couple years back, she really ran on wanting to modernize Hamden, and I know this is still a project that Hamden is working on. This is also something President-elect Trump wants to work on. So where do you think that these local funds for infrastructure should be allotted to, whether that's nationally or locally?
I think people are always talking about roads, right? Roads and bridges. Internet infrastructure, I think energy infrastructure, all these things are really important. Here in New England, we've had an energy grid that's been largely reliant on natural gas, which is a clean fuel, but it's still a fossil fuel. And so thinking about the energy infrastructure going forward, it would be nice to get some more investment into green energy sources and plugging that into the grid and expanding and reinforcing our grid. So things like that, these are all things that were targeted by the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, which have large amounts of money that are still in the pipeline and still have to be invested. And so I would expect we're going to see a lot of federal money still coming from Biden administration policies. I don't really expect, despite candidate Trump's rhetoric on the campaign field, to see much coming from the federal government in terms of new infrastructure investment in states like Connecticut.
And with more on this topic and other things across Connecticut, especially focused in New Haven, Q30's Connor Core spoke with Senator Gary Winfield of New Haven. Take it.
47-year-old Tyrell Glover is in New Haven on Tuesday, but will be voting in Branford for the first time in his entire life. He decided to vote this year after President Biden won the election all the way back in 2020. The past 4 years confirmed why he wanted to come out.
It's just not fair. It's not right. People need to stand up, you know what I'm saying, and make it right.
Glover told Q30 that he would be voting for former President Trump when he got to the polls in Branford. Connecticut has not seen the state go to a Republican candidate since 1988. Glover still thinks that his vote matters.
Democratic, but I think the people tired. It's time for Bill to change, man.
Incumbent Senator Gary Winfield won his district again in this year's election. When he talks about the national issues to his constituents, the biggest thing he is talking about is all the change that happens in the country and making it as simple as possible.
I'm a legislator who, the work I do, if you think it just came out of my head, you would be incorrect.
It really comes from the conversations that I have with people. And I realized early on, like a lot of legislators who know I have all these things I want to do, I realized early on that people are going to give you enough stuff that you never really have to go out there and just make it up.
Mike Huff and Lacey Neal were recently married and are starting to have conversations about Planned Parenthood. Neal believes that there is not a one-size-fits-all solution, but she believes that a well-thought-out plan is better than no plan at all.
I don't think the policies are perfect, to be honest, but who are really thinking through the issues that I care about and trying to take care of vulnerable people is on the Democratic side.
Now, no matter the outcome of the 2024 presidential election, people in New Haven and West Haven, the easiest thing they can do is exactly what they're doing behind me in City Hall. Go out and vote. Reporting in New Haven in front of City Hall for Q30 News, I'm Connor Core.
Once again, we have to take a quick break here on the Q30 Newscast.
After the break, we'll hear about the national impacts of the election and hear from perspectives of college students. Don't change that channel. We'll be right back.
Owen, when you came into my life, it was a whirlwind.
I just can't do it.
We didn't know what the future would hold, but we knew you would always be a part of it. Adopting you was the best decision in our life. And I am so proud to call you my son.
I tell my son, I love you every single day. Now, my dad has never said that to me. Not because he doesn't love me, but because culturally it wasn't comfortable for him. Now that he's a grandfather, he says, I love you to my son every time he sees him. My advice to all the fathers out there, forget the cultural restrictions. They grow up way too fast for you to waste even a single precious moment.
Welcome back. As we mentioned at the top of the show, the races for the presidency and Senate have been called by all major outlets for the Republican Party.
Julia and Sean, what do you guys have for us on the national impact of the 2024 election?
So something that the Harris campaign was really running on this year was abortion, was women's reproductive rights, and many left-leaning voters are now worried about those rights because of President-elect Trump being in office. What do you think that the future of women's reproductive rights, the future of abortion, will look like following this election?
That's really hard to tell because so much of the rhetoric was hyped up on both sides around this issue going into the election. To see how much of a priority issue it remains of the Trump administration and of the Republicans in Congress, whether or not they do plan, and if they have control of both houses of Congress, it would be easy for them to pass a national abortion bill, which would be, I think, quite worrisome particularly for people in states like Connecticut that still have reproductive freedom, to have that coming down from the national level. I think that we're likely to see more state-level efforts to clarify, particularly in states that have tried to limit reproductive freedom. We're likely to see more efforts at that state level to clarify exactly what that means, and maybe some pushback on some of the limits. I also wonder how much more of that agenda, there's part of that agenda that has been sort of when Dobbs was overturned, when Dobbs overturned Roe v. Wade, there was some discussion about whether there was a possibility of overturning things like marriage rights for same-sex partners and things like that as well. And so it will be interesting to see if the conservative wing of the Republican Party wants to push on those things. I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball as to whether they're going to want to move on that first or whether they'll want to move on more substantive issues having to do with the economy.
While Harris was running on that, President-elect Trump was running more on his conversations surrounding the border, what he called the border crisis. So that's what many Republicans are concerned about, and that's why many people voted for President-elect Trump. What do you think we could kind of expect to see happening and changing at the border now, especially between the two parties? As you mentioned, the Republicans also took many other seats across the Capitol. So what do you think we could kind of expect to see here?
One of the things I'd love to think is possible under unified government, even if it is Republican control and the Republican Party hasn't been motivated in recent years to really address the structural problem with immigration, but that would be comprehensive immigration reform. And I think we do have an opportunity now because of the unified control of government, should the Republicans take the House of Representatives back as well. I'm not sure we can expect to see that, but I think that would be the most logical direction to go. And it would be clearly a very Republican bill on immigration, but it might actually help to deal with some of the really structural issues around immigration. We have a huge demand for migrant labor in this country and no real system to provide it in a way that makes sense for people who are performing some of that labor. I would expect to see a little bit of a step up in enforcement at the border. I would think that we would probably see a return to trying to hold people outside the United States who are seeking asylum or refugee status. I would also expect to see, and I hope this doesn't happen too rapidly, I think it would be very destabilizing, but I would also expect to see more scrutiny within our communities of immigrants and their status, and more efforts to, as President-elect Trump mentioned, round them up and deport them. And I think this is going to be very destabilizing to our communities, particularly communities like the New Haven-Hamden area, where we have very high levels of migration and immigration, very large quantities of refugee statuses and asylees who are still waiting for asylum hearings and things like that, where that's all going to be very concerning and destabilizing for them, their families, and our larger communities.
Yeah, so with more on this national aspect, I'm going to give it back to Ben and Nick.
Young people and college students made up an important voting bloc of this election cycle.
Q30's Carter Kane spoke to Quinnipiac students to hear their thoughts on the 2024 elections.
I'm here inside the Carl Hansen Student Center. Q30 asked students a little bit about how they felt about the election and how it impacted them personally.
I voted early because I thought it was really good for me to as a first-time voter, just to get the experience, also just be a part of the decision, even if it's small.
I did decide to vote because I felt like the right thing to do, because it kind of decides a lot of things within this country.
We asked voters how they felt about this year's election and certain issues that they want to see handled.
It's definitely important. I think people should go out there and vote. Everybody is entitled to their own opinion, so definitely important. The most important thing is I think it's the outcome overall, how it can impact lives overall, whether you're native or foreign, how it can help you or not.
Everything, kind of. I mean, we're women, so that's a really big thing this election. There's a new, the female president. We might have the first, we might not. There's just a lot of controversy going around, so a lot of split divisions.
Probably climate policy. Climate policy, that, and just when it comes to women's rights, their rights to their own body.
I think it's very important, especially this election. Where America's very polarized right now, and so I think it's very heated at the moment, and everyone's watching, and so just can't wait to see what happens.
Overall, students were very excited to voice their opinions as voters about the upcoming election and are very excited for the results for the election. Reporting from the Carl Hansen Student Center, Carter Kane, Q30 News.
In addition to the presidential election having a massive impact domestically, it will have major implications internationally.
We'll send it back over to our panel for a discussion about how Trump's victory will affect America's foreign policy.
Yes, so more on the international aspect of things. This election didn't necessarily feel like a foreign policy election like we've seen in the past. However, we know that this is still a big topic of discussion, especially considering what's going on in the Middle East and the wars between Russia and Ukraine. Earlier today, we heard Putin did not congratulate, President-elect Trump, whereas Netanyahu, he did. So with this election turning now as President Trump is going to enter office, how do you think we can kind of expect to see a change in our role in these places like the Middle East and in Russia and Ukraine?
I think it may not have been a foreign policy election here in the United States, but it was very much on the minds of our allies in Europe. I was traveling in Europe this summer, and they were nothing but questions about what was going on here and discussions about the implications for Europe. The Europeans are celebrating nearly 80 years without substantive conflict. Ukraine conflict is the one that's really worrying them right now. And this has largely been because of the post-World War II consensus and the way that the United States has underwritten that consensus. They're very much worried that we're under a second Trump administration, we're going to abandon that consensus and leave the Europeans really to their own devices in terms of trying to maintain peace and security on that continent. And so that's really a very big concern for them. I think I would expect to see the United States rapidly try to wind down its support of Ukraine, and that will probably lead to a decisive victory for Russia and Ukraine, which will be a big concern for our NATO allies because it will put Russia right on the borders of NATO. I think similarly we will see even more support for the regime in Israel from the Trump administration, and perhaps an effort by the Trump administration to support the Israeli policy of dealing decisively once and for all with the Gaza problem. You can read between the lines of what I'm saying there a little bit. I'm really worried about that. I don't think the Trump administration is necessarily one that will try to uphold human rights in Palestine or Palestinian territories.
So you talk about NATO. Now we also talk about the UN. When President Trump was in office in 2016, there was a controversy about the U.S.'s role in the UN, in NATO. How do you think we could see a change now in our position in that after what President Biden has done with our relationships and our foreign relationships? How do you think that's going to change with President Trump in office?
I think our historical patterns with respect to the United Nations will remain more or less the same. We have had either really strongly internationalist administrations that have tried to work with and through the United Nations, and we've had largely two other sort of non-UN compatible approaches in our administrations. One is the sort of US go it alone kind of policy, and one is the kind of policy that says that the UN is corrupt and needs to be reformed. Those often go hand in hand together. I would expect to see more of the latter. And the Trump administration will not necessarily be unique or new in terms of the way the United States has worked with the United Nations, but I would expect to see more of a go it alone and use the United Nations when we can use it to advance our interests, but not necessarily to work through the UN or with our partners in the UN.
And with more of this concentration on the international impact, we have Q30, Andrew Allison.
Thanks, guys. President-elect Donald Trump has several plans for American foreign policy, specifically in the Middle East. First, Trump plans to bring peace to the Middle East through his personal influence, emphasizing an Israeli victory. Trump plans to maintain a hard line against Iran and may take an extreme stance against them during his second term. However, some U.S. conservatives are anti-interventionist and may embrace an America First doctrine. Moving north, Trump said in regards to the Russian-Ukrainian war that, quote, "If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day," end quote. Trump plans to meet with both the Russian and Ukrainian president to strike a deal and resolve the war. He also criticized American aid to Ukraine, saying, quote, it, quote, never ends. Closer to home, Trump has made it known that he will pursue American economic interests at the expense of trade allies and partners, saying, quote, we're going to take other countries' jobs, end quote. Trump plans to use tariffs aggressively, establishing a universal tariff of 10 to 20% on all imports, and that could reach as high as 60% on goods from China. Now back to Ben and Nick at the desk.
It's time for another commercial break.
Coming up after that break, we'll hear a financial update, and we'll also hear about the impact the election will have on the financial landscape. We'll be right back.
Have you ever helped a fellow veteran?
Of course.
Yes. Have you ever asked for help yourself?
It's always tough, right?
I always feel like I can solve my own problems, but eventually, you just can't deal with it on your own.
And you start to question, maybe people would be better off without me. When you realize that you're not alone, once you take that first step, there's so much support.
Multiple studies have shown that marijuana can slow both driver reaction and response time, which can be really dangerous. He's here. He's here. Wait. What? I can't drive. Why? My. Oh.
Meet the scan, a simple procedure whose mission is to detect lung cancer early.
I'm here to save you.
But I feel fine.
That's great, but you may still be at high risk for lung cancer.
Oh man, that's a new fence.
If you smoke, early detection could save your life. Learn more at savedbythescan.org.
Welcome back to the Q30 Newscast. A major issue that voters were focused on was the financial landscape.
Q30's Ashley Potvin is here in studio to give us an update on the post-election financial headlines.
Thanks, Nick and Ben. Starting off with President-elect Donald Trump, here are his plans for the economic policy. Trump plans to eliminate taxes on tips and Social Security benefits, as well as a plan to reduce the corporate tax rate. He aims to bring back the tax cuts he signed in 2017 and further reduce the taxes for individuals and corporations. He plans to lower the corporate tax rate to 15% from 21% in hopes of economic growth. Trump also hopes to influence Federal Reserve decisions, lower housing prices through the deportation of undocumented immigrants, no cuts to Social Security or Medicare, potential cuts to student loan relief programs, and cutting energy costs in half. After the results were finalized, he invited his Vice President J.D. Vance to the stage, where he said, quote, "We're going to lead the greatest economic comeback in American history under Donald Trump's leadership," end quote. Moving over to the stock market, the Dow Jones Industrial Average passed 1,000 points earlier today and continues to climb after Trump defeated Vice President Kamala Harris in the election. The S&P 500 and NASDAQ composite also saw large gains, jumping over 2%. All three markets' averages are currently on pace for a record close. That's all I have for a financial update on the 2024 election. Nick and Ben, back to you guys.
Thanks, Ashley. As we've seen, the economy was a major issue for voters this election.
Let's head over to Julia and Sean to hear about their thoughts about the political or the financial impact of the elections.
Yeah, as Ashley was talking about, the stock market reacted pretty well following Trump's win across the U.S. But what many people are concerned about is the job market. We see employment sitting at 4.1% according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and many people want to see that number decrease. I think that goes for both political parties. So now with President Trump back in office, do you think we're going to see an improvement in the job market? And how do you think that's going to vary, like that kind of discussion between the two parties of how to go about lowering that percentage is going to go?
I think this is where the national numbers are really kind of interesting to look at, and the political reaction to those national numbers are always a little bit delayed, but the last couple of months they've looked very good, actually. And the job numbers are actually not bad by historical standards right now, and inflation has come down. I would expect to see that sort of nice, stable picture of job numbers and inflation last for a while. I'm not sure it will be impacted much by what Trump does or by what President-elect Trump does, because economic policy is something that usually takes months, if not years, to actually have an effect. So I think the real tell of what President Trump's policies do will be seen 4, 5, 6 years to come.
Yeah, and we heard throughout the race that the Biden administration's economy hasn't been necessarily the best. Many people are worried about inflation, things like that. So how much of Biden's economy do you think was inherited by the Trump administration versus by Biden's policies that he implemented during his 4 years?
Well, I think clearly we can say that the impact of the pandemic was really what was the big shock to our economy back in 2020, 2021. And that resulted both in huge disruption of the labor market and a massive infusion of capital into the economy from federal government spending, which was necessary to keep us all working and eating and everything else during that time. But that has had the impact that has had to work through the economy over the last three and a half years since. I think more importantly is not necessarily what happened in the previous Trump administration, but what happened even 10 years before that with the financial crisis in 2008 during the George W. Bush administration. And we're still seeing the effects of that in high housing prices right now. We have a huge deficit in housing stock that's structural in its nature. It's not something that quick and easy fixes can address at either the local or the federal level, and local and state governments are really working hard on this. And I would hope that the incoming Trump administration will also start working with state governments to try to think about how to address that long-term structural problem with housing stocks. But I don't think that's something that can be fixed with decreasing taxes or things like that. It's going to require building more housing. So I think, long story short, I think it's those kinds of economic things that have had the biggest impact on people's experiences of the economy and their perception that we're living in a bad economy.
Yes, sticking with the economy, given that was voters' main concern for this election. That was what got a lot of people out to polls. That's what brought a lot of first-time voters out. Even if it wasn't their first election, that's what ultimately pushed them to go vote. So with that, and with the big concern of the increase of inflation over the past few years, do you think that with President-elect Trump back in office, we can maybe see a lower prices in day-to-day necessities? You talk about housing affordability, things like that. That's what a lot of people are concerned about.
I don't think housing affordability is going to get better anytime soon because, as I mentioned, that's a very structural problem. It's not something that can be dealt with quick and easy policy fixes. That being said, I think the inflation in other areas of the economy have already started coming down, and they've been coming down for the last several months. So I would expect people's experience of inflation to start to catch up to what the numbers are telling us. And they will very likely credit the Trump administration with this, but it'll probably have nothing to do with anything that the Trump administration does in its first couple of months of office.
Yeah, so another big concern that people have been having recently, even myself included, has been gas prices. You know, we've seen this big increase in gas, especially considering everything that's been happening with oil trade and all of that. So do you think that that's something else that should be of a main concern of President-elect Trump this time around?
This may be one area where gas prices will come down, and it may have more to do with the perception of what a Trump administration will do in terms of supporting oil industry development. And I think it's quite clear that the Trump administration intends to move us away from the clean energy development policies of the Biden administration and go back to drilling more and pumping more oil. And that anticipation will probably lead to more pumping of oil and more oil development, and even the future prices of oil on the stock markets will start to be reflected in the prices at the pump.
Thank you. And with that, that's going to wrap us up for right here. Sean, we appreciate you coming in. Thank you so much for your time tonight, this evening. For Q30 News for now, I'm Julie Barcello. Back to Nick and Ben.
That's all we have tonight on the Q30 Newscast. Thank you to all the producers and everyone working hard behind the scenes.
Also, make sure to follow Q30 News on X to stay informed. For Ben Rickovicius, I'm Nick Boyd. Stay safe and have a good night.